if you've paid attention to the secularist kind of critique of Christianity, one of the arguments you will have heard from the secularist camp and also from some of the more kind of radical Protestant sects is that Christmas is a pagan festival. In my youth, I remember growing up, there were people in the church where I grew up who argued for that and said that Christmas was a pagan festival, that it's not scriptural, it's not in the Bible, and it was basically Christians taking over the pagan myths, taking over the pagan festival, specifically Sol Invictus, which was on December 25th. By the way, Sol Invictus is a very late holiday, but you probably might have seen other videos debunking this, and so I obviously will give you the basics of why this is not true, but we're also going to try to look at the deeper reasons or the deeper, let's say, questions that are happening. Why is it that people want this to be true? What is motivating this kind of statement, and how it is that we can not only fight the details in terms of debunking the ridiculous connotation that Christmas is a pagan festival, but debunk it in a bigger way that is also debunk the very attitude and the very approach which would lead people into saying such a thing.
Hello there. Well, this is Martin Shaw, and I'm afraid whatever you had planned for January, scrap it. I am returning to Symbolic World gleefully with one of the great stories of our time, the Epic of Parzival, the story of the Holy Grail itself. Over 5 nights, I will be telling the tale. These will not be dry lectures or PowerPoint presentations. These will be wild, old, philosophical storytelling in its deepest dimensions. It is life-changing stuff, this story. I've written a book about it. I've been studying it for 20 years. I've told it all over the world, but I have not shared it with you. I've not shared it with Symbolic World. So what else would you want to do in the great wintering time but to sit at the feet of this wonderful story and let me be your guide? I'll see you there.
This is Jonathan Pedro. Welcome to the Symbolic World. So in the 3rd century, the Roman emperor, declared a festival on December 25th, which was called Sol Invictus, which was the invincible sun. And it happened to coincide on the date that most Christians thought that Christ was born. The way that Christians came to the conclusion that Christ was born is one which is not completely in tune with modern ways of thinking, but it is nonetheless an internal manner by which they calculated this. And the way they did was there was a tradition according to which Christ had been conceived on the same day that he died. That is, obviously not on the same year, but of the same calendar day that he died. That was the day of the Annunciation, the day that Christ was conceived. That is why, for example, in the Catholic and the Orthodox tradition, the Annunciation always kind of falls during Lent at some point, and sometimes even during Holy Week, because it is originally on the year that Christ died. Then it would have been the same day as Pascha, the same day as Easter. And then if you take that, it's March 25th, and then you add 9 months, you get to December 25th. And that is the way that Christians came to understand that Christ was born on December 25th. It is there in Augustine, it is mentioned in Augustine, and then ultimately this is the tradition that gets taken up by different Christians. Of course, before that, Christians celebrated mostly Epiphany or Theophany, which is in January, and was in some ways a more general feast, which was the revelation of the light of Christ. And in the feast of Theophany or Epiphany, you have all the moments where the divinity of Christ is revealed. And so they celebrated aspects of the nativity, aspects of the wise men that come and recognize the Christ child as being born. and then also baptism, because when Christ was baptized and he came out of the water, that is when we heard the voice of God the Father saying, "This is my son." And so it was more of a general festival of light and of the revelation of God. But then ultimately Christians separated those two feasts and decided to celebrate the birth of Christ specifically. And because traditionally they had accepted that it was on December 25th, that is when it ultimately was chosen. Now, in the Reformation, there were some movements, especially in the Puritans, to criticize that and to start to say that, in fact, Christmas was not scriptural and that Christmas was a pagan festival because it fell on the same day as the Roman festival of Sol Invictus, and it came in the same season as the ancient Saturnalia, which were, I think, until December 23rd. And so because of that, they tried to connect the celebration of Christmas with a kind of carnival, a kind of inversion festival. They also tried to connect it with the worship of the sun as the kind of the return of the sun, you could say. And then that criticism got taken up in the Enlightenment, and then ultimately got taken up by kind of 19th century anthropologists and 19th century religious, in parentheses, thinkers like Fraser, who ultimately was trying to frame Christianity as a kind of nature religion, as a kind of copying of the ancient, supposedly dying and rising God, and that ultimately the celebration of Christmas was related to the solstice and the return of the sun and all of that. And what's fascinating about this is that it's technically false. Like, it's just technically false. That is just not the reason why Christian chose that date for the birth of Christ. But what's interesting is how, in fact, these Puritans and then ultimately these kind of materialist religious scholars, they're onto something. They're onto something. They're onto the fact that even though the choosing of the birth of Christ was related to the date of his death and the Annunciation, that why would it surprise us that it would in fact fall around the time of the solstice? Because the idea of Sol Invictus, of the kind of victorious sun, we also believe that is true in Christ, that the revelation of the incarnate God, and as a child that will then grow and start to be shown more and more, that is what happens at the solstice. That is, the sun is at its lowest point, and then the sun starts to rise up in the heavens. And so the fact that there is a symbolism between the solstice and the birth of Christ is not something that should scare us. Why should it scare us that the way that God created the world and the fact that meaning is deeply ingrained in these great cosmic patterns, why would that freak us out? Because it connects to Christian symbolism. It's really fascinating because even if the Christians had chosen that date for the reason in relationship to the solstice, if they had chosen it, because they would have come to the conclusion that Christ must have been born on the day, around the time of the solstice, because he is the true rising sun and all of these other reasons, that would not for that reason make it a pagan holiday. Why would it make it a pagan holiday? Because God is the one who created the world. These great cosmic patterns that the pagans did notice and that the pagans did celebrate are nonetheless also the language that God has used to create the world. They are the words of God inscribed in natural processes. They are not evil. They are not, they are not perverse on their own. They can be perverted. They can come to serve evil. But isn't it the job, or isn't it one of the great things that Christians can do, which is to turn that symbolism towards the good? And then after that, then you can understand that all of the ways in which people have then started to say that the different aspects of the Christmas traditions that got celebrated in different places, that these are pagan. You have people saying that the Christmas tree is a pagan image, that it's what the ancient pagans, they decorated trees around this time, that the holly, that all of these things are all these kind of, ancient pagan traditions. And what it shows is that, in fact, Christianity is just basically paganism with, a little bit of a Christian veneer on top. And again, this is absolutely ridiculous. The idea, for example, of using an evergreen tree to represent the the incarnation of Christ is particularly beautiful. The idea that the thing that survives through death, the thing that does not die, even though everything else around it is dying, the thing that maintains life in the darkest and coldest moment, that is a beautiful image of Christmas. It's a beautiful image of the incarnation. And if you've seen my different videos on the symbolism of the Christmas tree and on these different symbolism, you'll see that the very way that the Christmas tree is decorated with the star at the top and the gifts at the bottom, and the all of the ornaments all along, is a beautiful cosmic image of the revelation of God. And it's connected directly to the story of the Nativity, with having either a star or an angel at the top of the tree, because that is what happened at the time of the birth of Christ. That is, a star or an angel appeared to the shepherds or to the wise men, and then announced the birth of Christ, announced this great gift. And you can imagine, like, all the decorations in the tree as the myriads of angels, the myriads of the choir of heaven that is singing the glory of this moment, is revealing the glory of this moment. There are all of these aspects that you can understand, that what you realize is that what you're facing when you see these kinds of arguments is actually a kind of reductionism. What you're facing in the type of argument that would say that a Christmas tree is pagan, or that this or that aspect is pagan, or Christmas candles are pagan, or all of these types of practices that people have during Christmas, that they're pagan, or gift giving, or all of this stuff, that it's pagan. What you're dealing with is not paganism. What you're dealing with is a opposition that is formulated in reductionism. That is, there is this idea, this kind of Enlightenment idea, that in fact Christianity moves away from ritual, that Christianity in fact is more secular, you could say, in its practices, that it has to do only with ethics, that it has to do only with morality, and that you have to demythologize Christianity and get rid of all of these superstitious practices and these externals, and get only to the relationship of the heart. That is what you're dealing with. You're not actually dealing with questions of Christianity or paganism. And so the same types of people that would say that, for example, the Christmas tree is pagan and that all of these things are pagan, would probably say that all the different aspects of the liturgy are also taken from pagan things, that, the staff of the bishop is just an ancient sorcerer's wand taken from this or that. It's kind of, if you know about Chick Comics, that's how Chick Comics takes it. They take anything that looks symbolic, anything that has, a deeper meaning, and then what they do is they reduce it to a kind of superstition, and they call on it as being pagan, because obviously Christians, what they did was to remove all of those external things and to only exist in the heart. But that is just simply not true. That is not how Christians acted. That is not how Christians acted from the beginning, and it is certainly not how Christians acted as they kind of took over Europe and became the leading culture in Europe. What they did is that they developed traditions that were making the world meaningful, and was making the world in a shape that would help us remember and help us celebrate and help us participate in these important feasts and in these important aspects. And so even then we could say, like, is it possible that maybe some of these aspects would have been stolen or taken from the pre-Christian societies? And the answer is probably. Is that a problem? The answer is no, it is not a problem at all. It is not a problem. And what's super interesting about that is that someone who, for example, would object to these kinds of traditions might be the same kind of person that doesn't have a problem with Christian rock and roll, or doesn't have a problem with, a band in their church playing a guitar, bass, and drum, and because that is not something that comes from within the Christian aesthetic, And so what Christians would do is that they would take certain things that they could be transformed and could be made into a shape that could participate in the Christian story, whether they're taken from pagan sources, or sometimes they're just taken from Christian sources. That is, different legends or different people that have insights about things that we can do in order to remember and to celebrate the Christian feast. And this is, of course, true about so many things. It's true about people, the way people talk about Halloween, the way that people talk about Easter. And so, for example, the idea, for example, that at Easter there's a bunny that lays eggs. It's like, is that a pagan story? And the answer is, it's not a pagan story. It's a story about spring, and it's a story about reproduction and fertility, and the kind of the awakening of that aspect of the world in spring. And you might ask yourself, is that pagan? Well, what are you talking about? How is fertility pagan? This idea that fertility, anything that's related to fertility or anything that's related to reproduction, that is necessarily pagan, because obviously Christians don't have babies, Christians don't have sex, Christians don't participate in fertility. It's all very ridiculous, and so I think that we just have to radically change the way that we think about these things, and realize that all these modes of participations, all these images that are projected, sometimes that they have no author, they just kind of happen. Sometimes we have to be careful the place that they take. Obviously, nobody should have an icon of the Easter bunny in the church, and nobody should, have an Easter hunt inside the church, like an egg hunt inside the church. And there are all these, you have to obviously find the right hierarchy. For example, I think it's fine to have a Christmas tree in the church. Don't put it in the altar, though. You should probably have it either in the narthex or maybe somewhere in the nave that's a little tucked aside. And so you just have to basically find the right place for all of these traditions and all of these kinds of things that we do. But it doesn't mean that they're pagan. It doesn't mean that they're evil. It doesn't mean that they're twisted. And it certainly doesn't mean that they are superstitious. And so, if you have felt in your, some kind of unease about these things, some kind of unease about the way in which we celebrate these holidays, and you have taken seriously these ridiculous accusations that they are pagan somehow. First of all, most of the time that is technically false. And one of the things, it's really important, by the way, one of the things to really understand is that it is often very technically false. It is often a kind of, you could say, speculation on the part of these thinkers, because they don't have access to those pagan cultures. Those pagan cultures didn't have writing. Those pagan cultures didn't have any kind of documentation. And so the idea that these traditions would come from pagan cultures is pure, absolute, pure speculation. There is no way that they have access to the pre-Christian Europe, as if they could see into the 4th century in Gaul, or they could see, into the 6th or 7th century or 8th century in Scandinavia. This is absolute madness. It's pure speculation. All we have are the things we have. And so we have to see them for the meaning that they possess and what it is that they're manifesting. And that is really, truly what matters. And so, do not hesitate to celebrate these holidays. Do not hesitate to participate in these kinds of images, because most of them are quite beautiful, and they're especially beautiful if they are in their proper place and they are put in the proper participation in the great hierarchy of images that we participate in to celebrate the birth of Christ and all of the other Christian holidays. So I hope this was a little bit of a rant, a little bit of a something that sometimes I think that it's over, that we're done with these kind of ridiculous arguments about Christianity and Easter and Christmas and paganism. But hopefully this will also help you if you still have doubts on that subject. So thanks, everyone. I hope you all have a Merry Christmas, and I'll talk to you very soon. Bye-bye.